and welcome everyone. I'm Lydia Stazen. I'm the Executive Director at the Institute of Global Homelessness, and I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion. I'll be sharing a little bit more about IGH later on, but first I want to welcome all of our guests watching today and also give a warm thanks to C20 for hosting us for this conversation on data and social inclusion for people who are homeless. We believe that the voice of civil society is really critical to influencing policy, and so we appreciate the importance of this platform in suggesting policy to the G20. The civil society is an independent engagement group of the G20 and is the global platform for civil society organizations in the G20 process, delivering civil society's demands to world leaders. The C20 community is comprised of more than 1,000 civil society organizations from all corners of the world, which have been channeling the voice of civil society into the G20 process since 2013. Every year, the C20 convenes voices from civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, global policy experts, and G20 senior officials, ministerial representatives from G20 and non-G20 countries, activists and influencers to determine the policy solutions required to ensure sustainable and inclusive societies. So again, we are thrilled to be a part of this conversation and participating in this important platform. In terms of homelessness, IGH and many of our partner organizations through the United Nations NGO Working Group to End Homelessness are really working to raise the issue of homelessness more and more within the United Nations context. It might surprise you to know that homelessness is not mentioned in any one of the SDGs or their 169 indicators. And we think that's a critical oversight. Addressing homelessness is necessary for the successful achievement of all of the SDGs. For example, how can we end poverty, as SDG 1 aims to do, without specifically addressing and implementing solutions to homelessness? So for us, as we talk today, our panel discussion will touch on how we can make the invisible visible through data, and thus really bring the voices and experiences of people who are homeless fully into the conversation as partners. So I'm pleased today to introduce first my colleague, Julia Wagner, who is our program manager at IGH. Julia, could you please share a little bit about yourself with today's audience?
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. As Lydia said, I'm a program manager for the Institute of Global Homelessness, and part of my work is supporting IGH's Vanguard Cities program, where we work with 13 global cities. And I also work on our Better Data project, where we collect global homeless data in order to improve definition and measurement. And I'm going to be sharing about the Better Data project today.
Thank you, Julia. I'm also happy to welcome Indu Prakash Singh, City Makers facilitator in Delhi and other parts of India, and an incredible activist on the issue of homelessness. Indu, could you please share a little bit about yourself with today's audience?
Thank you, Lydia, for having me in this panel. Well, friends, for about 40 years, I've been working on women's issues, and for about 20 years on the homeless issues. We call them city makers, for they made the city with a certain labor, and they have every right to the city. And so all that I'm sharing about is from my experience across India. So not just Delhi, but other cities of India also, we've been working very directly.
Thank you, Indu. And last but certainly not least, I'm happy to welcome today Rob Robinson from New York City, who joins us to bring his perspectives on human rights, data, and the experience of homelessness. Rob, could you please share a little bit about yourself with today's audience?
Sure. Thank you very much, Lydia, and it's an honor to be here. And I want to thank the Institute of Global Homelessness for inviting me. My name is Rob Robinson. I'm formerly homeless. I spent 2.5 years on the streets of Miami homeless and 10 months in the New York City homeless shelter. And today I organize with grassroots movements, both in the United States and around the world, for the right to housing, and do that through a number of different mechanisms. That is by participating in government agencies here in the US, but also working closely with UN special rapporteurs on the right to adequate housing. So it's an honor again to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. So we'll be hearing more from each panelist in a few moments, and we'll have a great discussion around data and social inclusion for people who are experiencing homelessness. But as we go along, for the audience, if you could please be posting your comments and questions in the chat box. We've allotted a good portion of time for us to be interacting with your responses, your feedback, your questions. So please be chatting away, and we welcome you also then as panelists and participants in this discussion. And just a fair warning, if you don't have those questions, Indu and I will probably talk about feminism for the last half of the presentation. So do be putting those questions in the chat box. So we'll move now to kind of the main part of our conversation. So as many of you may know, tomorrow is World Homeless Day. This is an internationally observed day that really lifts up the voice and experience of people who are homeless and calls us and galvanizes us to further action on this issue. World Homelessness Day has been observed for several years, but also falls within the month known as Urban October, which is a month of events coordinated by United Nations Habitat and their partners, highlighting how important cities are to a vibrant and sustainable world and looking at innovative solutions to problems that are uniquely faced by cities and settlements. While we know that homelessness is not confined to cities, but also exists in rural areas, we do recognize that the majority of homelessness is experienced with urban settings. So again, we're very pleased to be having this conversation right on the heels of World Homeless Day and within this month of Urban October. So at the Institute of Global Homelessness, our mission is to bring an end to global homelessness. We know that that's a big, ambitious mission, but we know that it can be achieved with the right mix of political will, partnerships, resources, and effective solutions. I'm going to be sharing my screen now to show you a little bit more about how IGH thinks about tackling a big issue like global homelessness. Just pausing for a moment to let my screen load. So IGH's 3 strategic priorities fall into 3 different buckets. The first bucket, which really we'll be talking about today, is what we call See It, where we are advocating for international homelessness policy focused on definitions of global homelessness and how to measure global homelessness. We know that what is invisible gets ignored. And so it's our goal and our aim to be continually lifting this issue of homelessness into the conversation and really seeing the people who are having this experience. Our next bucket of work, which really Julia leads, we call Solve It. We are partnering with 13 international cities in many different countries around the world that are ready to take concrete action to end homelessness. So we work with them to set specific goals and to create work plans and to really help them make progress towards those goals they've set in reducing and ending homelessness. And that work in the field is so critical to informing all the other parts of our work. And then our final bucket is Share It. So what's working around the world that we see, and how can we share that with more and more people so that we continue to build this global movement of people who know what works in addressing homelessness and can spread that learning around the world so that all together we're doing this work kind of better, smarter, faster, and making sure that fewer people experience homelessness and that when they do, they are quickly moved into a permanent housing solution. So that's a little bit about IGH, and you can learn more at our website, which is ighomelessness.org. And you can also find us on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, and we look forward to engaging in conversation with you on those platforms as well. One of the very first things that IGH did when we were founded was create what we call a framework for defining homelessness. We recognize that around the world, homelessness looks different across many different contexts. And so we worked with preeminent homelessness researchers to do a lot of different interviews with key stakeholders to look at different typologies of homelessness that had been created in the future and create kind of a comprehensive look at what homelessness can look like around the world. And so you can see we've settled in 3 different categories that then have a variety of subcategories within them. The first one is people without accommodation. So starting at kind of the top left of my screen, this category includes people who are literally sleeping on the streets or, under bridges or on the pavements, sleeping in other open spaces. Then moving down, people who are sleeping in buildings that weren't meant for people to live in. I think certainly that happens in my hometown of Chicago. It happens in Croatia, in the city of Rijeka, we see a lot of homelessness where people are living in kind of abandoned or decrepit buildings. We also around the world will see people sleeping in their cars or other types of transportation that again were not meant for humans to live in. And then also some of our communities have lifted up this phrase of pavement dwellers, or people who are living on the street, but they're living in a regular spot, and they maybe have put up a little tent or some kind of a makeshift shelter over them. So that's people without accommodation. Then in the middle category, you'll see the phrasing of temporary or crisis accommodation. So this is where we see homeless shelters, homeless hostels, other types of temporary accommodations. For our colleagues in the UK, they often call these B&Bs, people who are living in domestic violence shelters, people living in internally displaced persons camps, temporary accommodation for asylum seekers, those types of things. So they have somewhere to stay, but it's more tied to the crisis that they're experiencing, and it's meant to be temporary. That's also a form of homelessness. And then finally, in the third category, we have people living in severely inadequate and insecure accommodation. So this category includes what's sometimes called couch surfing or sofa surfing, people who are sharing with friends and relatives, but on a temporary basis, so they're not permanently living with those friends and relatives, people who are living under the threat of violence and may have to leave their accommodation at any given moment, people who are living in housing that's unfit for human habitation. I remember a story of a woman here in Chicago who was living in an apartment where all of the water and electricity had been turned off. So that was very inadequate accommodation for her. People who are living in very overcrowded situations, people who are living in non-conventional buildings and temporary structures. So really we work to have a comprehensive definition that allows for flexibility for countries and communities to define what homelessness looks like for them, in their particular context. And so we've used this framework in many different communities where we've gone in and showed them the framework and said to them, what does homelessness look like to you? Is it reflected here? Is it not reflected here? And this has been a very helpful tool for us in creating a common language with different countries and contexts where homelessness might look different. We know based on this framework that we're talking about the same problem. So I'm going to stop my screen from sharing for a moment and just want to turn to our different panelists to get their feedback on this framework. So, first I'll toss it to you, Indu. When you think about homelessness in the Indian context, do you see that reflected in IGH's framework? How would you change it? What would you add? What would you take away?
Well, in fact, first of all, I must say that, when this framework was being made, we were also part of it. And we did contribute to, various nuances as such. And I do see that, the IGH, parameters that we have of 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, till 2 or 2C, you mentioned is bold. I think all those parameters are very well, captured. And I think we are perfectly fine with that because it brings in our nuances, it brings in our realities as such. So thank you for that. It captures our stuff.
Thank you, Indu. And Rob, what's your reflection on this framework?
I would agree with Indu. As you were doing the presentation, I'm thinking of all of the different places that I visited in the world. And particularly, I understood from a trip to Budapest, Hungary in 2009, right? They tend to say sleeping rough, right? And sometimes there's language differences that mean the same thing. So, but, as I looked at your presentation, I'm looking at all these different countries that have been able to witness homelessness and fit it into that framework. So I think it did a great job at capturing in different countries. It's not only representative of the US, but also in different countries around the world. And I think one of the biggest links or the most important links in that framework for me is you heard in my opening presentation about myself that I work closely with UN rapporteurs and made a strong connection in 2014 in Detroit with the UN Rapporteur on Housing and the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to water and sanitation, because those two things are related. If you're going to have adequate housing, it means you need adequate sanitation and running water, right? And clean, affordable drinking water. So I think the framework did a great job of capturing the issue.
Thank you, Rob. That's such an important point. I think that these basic human needs are all connected: sanitation, water, housing. And again, you see that interconnection through the SDGs, and you also see the omission of specifically homelessness. The other thing, that I want to share about that framework, it's so important to us as an organization working internationally that we are really listening to people on the ground in communities where we work. And so we're constantly, bringing that framework to them and asking them these questions. Does this resonate with you? And, one colleague, that I was speaking with in Nairobi, Kenya, when we were gathered together for an expert group meeting a couple of, probably about 18 months ago, back when we could travel around the world. He was reminding me of the importance of the cultural context and how in his community, it was not inadequate for people to be living in a hut with a clean dirt floor and a thatched roof and no running water, and that was perfectly appropriate to their context. And that was a good reminder for me to always be listening with big open ears to our partners on the ground as to what is adequate accommodation for their circumstance. So again, I will invite the audience to be putting their answers to my questions to Indu and Rob into the chat box. So what are your impressions of that framework? Think about the community where you live and the ways that homelessness shows up there. We'd love to hear from your comments in the chat. So please do be adding that. Okay, so again, it's clear to see that homelessness looks and is defined differently across the globe, but each of these definitions are as valid and powerful as the other. And so this really leads us to one of our main challenges, which is how do we then count people who are experiencing homelessness? If it's defined differently in different places, how do we get a global count? One thing that we are constantly asked at IGH is how many people in the world are homeless? And the truth is we don't really have a good answer for that right now, but we're tired of saying that we don't know. And so we have launched what we are calling the Better Data Project to kind of highlight these gaps in definitions, these gaps in measurements, so that we can do a better job globally at collecting this information. And so, Julia, I'm going to ask you now to share a little bit with the audience about this Better Data Project and walk us through our map.
Thanks, Lydia. And in our work with the Vanguard cities across 6 continents, we use the IGH framework to help align definitions and to better understand, what you're counting. But when we researched global homeless data, we found that this varies very widely. So the Better Data Project is designed to better understand the range of available homeless data and spotlight the vast differences in definition and also in data quality. So in creating this map, we use whatever data was available. So that could be, government data, an intergovernmental source, or in some cases, because there was no other data available, a news article, or a nonprofit's unofficial count, which was the best available data. And so we know that these numbers don't necessarily compare, and that all these numbers are not created equal. And that in some countries, the data can be more or less transparent, accurate, and reliable, and not all the numbers should be taken at face value. And so I think the goal of this project is really to demonstrate how countries differ on definition and methodologies, and then improve the data over time. Because what we really want to do is solve global homelessness, and what gets measured gets done. So we really want to work with countries and have every country improve their homeless data collection so we can compare, we can have accurate definitions that represent their context. So there are, as I said, there's a lot of definition and methodological differences, and in looking at the data, only 107 countries throughout the world have reported homeless data in some form, and that, as I said, that could be a news article or official government data, and only 37% of those countries have reported it since 2017. So a lot of this data is older and out of date, and that really doesn't lend itself to accurately having strategies to end homelessness. So I'm going to share my screen so I can get a little deeper into this data and show you some of the initial data of the Better Data Project. So we also have a story map available on our IGH's website, which has some great visualizations that help you better understand the data. So I encourage you to check that out. You can find it through IGH's home screen, and we should be able to share it as well. So this data is representing homeless data per 100,000 people. And so you can see the varying differences in how many people are homeless throughout the world. And in looking at the legend, the data is also, there's many countries that have large homeless populations due to refugees or internal displacement. So that's also highlighted on the map as well. And then if you, and you can do this yourself on our story map, you can dig into the different definitions of homelessness, how we found it aligned with the IGH framework. We also have some notes on the data, as you know, a lot of the data, even if it's an official government number, because there might be some conflicting data that it's an undercount or it's not representative, it's not inclusive enough. So we wanted to make sure to have all of that information there. And so you can see for every country, we have this data, but for some countries, there is no available data. So those countries are represented in white. So, and this slide and map represents kind of the available sources that we were able to find. So if, this can differ by country. So for example, in Brazil and Bolivia, we use official government data, but for some countries like Argentina, for as far as countrywide data, we are only able to find a news media report. And you know, the Better Data Project, we're constantly updating sources, so we will continue to look and improve this map. And please feel free to send in your own data from your country if you have a more recent source. So this is highlighting by year of source. So you can see we only have 3 countries that have reported data this year, but we have a lot of more countries that are in green, which show that they were more than 5 years old. So we want to make sure that homeless data is done regularly so that it has an accurate count. And my final slide goes over homeless data by methodology. And so this kind of goes an overview of how homeless data is collected. So some countries use administrative data. So this is collected by person level. And then some countries use estimates. And so this would not be as accurate as a source depending on how it was collected. And then some countries use street counts as well. So this data can be found in the map, and it shows the varying degrees of what's currently available and how there is a need to have better data in the future. And I encourage you, as I said, to check out our story maps because it will allow you to get a better idea of what we mean by definition and how this can vary by country that are right next to each other.
Thank you, Julia. So I think, the audience can probably see some of the complications that different definitions cause and how different types of counting, different methodology of counting, all lead to this really complicated way of answering the question, how many people in the world are homeless? And so it's our hope that through the Better Data Project, more countries and more communities will begin to align with different definitions of homelessness to count regularly, to count according to specific methodology, so that at some point we'll be able to say, let's look at all the countries in the world who define homelessness according to category 1A who are using point in time counts. And then we'll be able to really compare between communities what's working to end homelessness and what isn't working to end homelessness, because sometimes we learn more from the failures than we do from the successes. So again, like Julia said, please go play around with that map on our website. It's laid out even more clearly than what Julia showed us on the screen. So you can scroll down and read through different definitions, different methodologies. And we really see this, this interactive map as the first step in a long process of getting countries and communities to define and to measure homelessness. I think the other thing to note about homeless data is that it's never going to be perfect data, but having an understanding of some sense of the scope of the problem that you're looking to tackle and regularly measuring will still show you whether things are trending down or trending up. So anytime you try to measure human behavior, anytime you try to measure humans and humans who are coming and going and moving is kind of a messy process. So we understand that, the data will always reflect that reality of human behavior. Okay, just pulling up my show notes now. So at this point, I'd really like to open the conversation back up to Indu and Rob and get their perspectives. So we'll start this time with Rob. And in your experience and opinion, how helpful is data to addressing the problem?
Well, I think data is very important in addressing the problem, but how you receive the data and how you account for the data, I think, is important in this conversation. And I'll give you an example. So in my role as somebody who's formerly homeless, a person with lived experience, I'm very involved in New York City in something called the Continuum of Care, where we oversee in New York City the distribution and administration of $120 million in federal government funds that goes to homelessness plus services. So in that role, I am supposed to participate in something called the HOPE count. HOPE is an acronym for Homeless Outreach Population Estimate. And just to give you a picture of how that happens, the last Monday in January of every year, the government mandates that homeless people, street homeless people be counted, and we do this count across the US. Well, the last Monday in January is very cold in New York City. It's in the middle of the winter, and that count is done from midnight to 4 a.m. in the morning. And the argument is anybody who's on the street is absolutely street homeless. But the counter argument that I bring is that anybody who was on the street between 12 and 4 o'clock in the morning just has no other place to go. However, people find places to go. People who are street homeless are resilient. They understand the weather. So they're going to get away from the elements. So we need to balance that count with maybe account the last Monday in July when you account for the weather in New York, which is the spring, and people surface. They're in the parks. They're on the subway system in New York. So I think there are some challenges to the way we collect data in the U.S. that makes the count problematic. But by the same token, I'm appreciative that a count is being done because we do need data to really hold our government and our society accountable for the large numbers of people that are homeless in the wealthiest country in the world.
Thank you, Rob. So again, that idea that maybe the count isn't perfect, but it's still valuable to do because if it's done consistently, we still can see a general trend line over time of up or down.
That's right.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Indu, can you share your experience and your perspective on the data and some ways that you have used the data in India on homelessness?
Yeah, thank you, Lydia, for this question, and it's a very important one. What I want to bring here as such up front is that, see, this is a publication called The Capital's Homeless, which we published in, the survey was done in 2000. And if you see, we have got a proper, terms of where are the homeless located in Delhi, the zones and all. And this, we took about 12 nights from about 12 o'clock until early morning. Different zones of Delhi was, categorized. And we went about head counting the people on the streets. We counted 52,765 people on the streets of Delhi in the month of May. And what I want to bring here, and then similarly, we did another count in 2008, where we counted 88,410 people on the streets of Delhi. The problem is that we have a census, which is the government body, and Census 2001 said that there are only 24,966 people who are homeless. Census 2011 said that there are only 46,724 homeless, whereas our 2008 figures said that there are 88,410 people. So census was always short by half. And we say for everyone counted, we missed one because there are many who also, because we're doing this in the night, so that there are many who are sleeping in the lanes and by lanes and all that. So a caveat that for everyone counted, one missed. So that gives you a figure of about 100,000 people in 2000 and 180,000 people in 2008 or so. So somewhere the official estimates have always been an underestimate. And I want to quickly share here, Lydia, also, for us, the Delhi Human Development Report of 2006 mentions a study, that what we found. So in a way, the government also accepted the data we gave, census did not. So it's very important that the civil society, whether the data is accepted or not, we do our own service and we were meticulous. We didn't do double counting. We eliminated all the possibilities. We did not, unlessly collect people as homeless, It was 52,765, not 766, period, So we followed the principles of truth, justice, and everything, We didn't want to muddle with the data as such. So it's very important to have the right data as such.
Yeah, so a couple of key things there, Indu, I think that you brought out. And one is, what is the trustworthiness or what is the confidence in that data set? I think all of us are familiar with certain governments or even certain NGOs wanting to manipulate data to tell a certain story, and that can fairly easily be done. So the importance of having multiple counts, multiple actors being involved in those counts, and building that trust among those stakeholder groups towards better, more accepted data. One community in which IGH was working had 6 different counts of people who were experiencing homelessness, and a lot of tension within the community about which count was the right account or the right count. And again, just encouraging them that no count is perfect. Work together collaboratively to decide amongst yourselves which count you would like to use, and just going forward with that. So again, importance of collaboration, of multiple stakeholders coming together around the counts, of working together to build trust around the counts. And also, Indu, I think you kind of brought up the way that you've been able to use those other counts to advocate with the government. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, in fact, what we did was, like, when the government used to come up with the figures, like even the census and all, I think in 2001, we took the objection saying that, see, you have not counted the homeless properly. In 2011 also, we gave the memorandum to the Registrar General of India that you have underestimated. And so his thing was, okay, actually, we can now rectify it 10 years later, which means 2021, we're going to have census again. So we said, but this is not done. This is criminal, So for many of us, we were upfront. We went into the media and said that the census is actually doing a fraud and a farce in terms of the homeless data. On everything else, it might be fine, but that pressure was there in the census, that there was one group. We didn't say about other data. We said about the homeless data, because that's what we saw on the streets, and that is what actually enabled us to take up the matter in the High Court and Supreme Court. And a Supreme Court appointed committee comes up and says that there are 300,000 people homeless in Delhi. So then the court believes its own commission. So I think somewhere, the government of India's own census department actually has not, and we've seen it on the streets, Lydia, these chaps come drunk in the night. We did from 12 o'clock in the night until early morning. They come about 9 o'clock and leave by 12. This is not census. This is not enumeration. We were religiously doing it from 12 to 5:30, and that matters. And like there's this Delhi government, Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board. In 2014, they did the head count from about 9 o'clock till 11 o'clock in the night. And they said there are only 16,724 homeless people. Now, that is again an estimate. And then when we, now being the Supreme Court Monetary Committee member in Delhi, we asked them, give us a report. Can you believe it? They said, we don't have the report. So we said, then please junk your report. Please junk this data. We're not using the data. So they had to junk the data, So it's like we can use pressure by the simple fact that we actually are there on the ground. We are counting people and we know our facts. Come and verify it with us. Join us in the night surveys, we do.
Yeah, thank you, Indu. And I think that also, your explanation there, I think highlights again how, yes, different methodologies can be used for counting homelessness,
Yes.
but some of those methodologies are stronger than others. For example, the use of a census. I know the United States is going through our census right now, and how did I get my census package to fill out? They mailed it to my home. So how do people who are homeless get counted in that census? It's much more difficult to do. So while census can be used to count people who are homeless, we know automatically that it's very likely to be an undercount. So again, what's the definition you're using? What is the methodology that you're using? And then I'm also thinking, Indu, as you talk about how is that methodology communicated? How is it transparent? So that we can understand the problem that's being measured and then how it's being measured. Rob, with your experience with the HMIS committees there in the continuum of care, do any examples come to mind about transparency of data?
Yeah, I'll start out with, and I know sometimes we're in this work and we talk in acronyms, so Lydia just mentioned HMIS, that's Homeless Management Information Systems. So it's a system that our federal government developed to count homelessness across the US. And in particular in New York, and that is my background before I went homeless, was working for a large corporation called Automatic Data Processing. And I worked in collecting data, so it was something I was always fascinated with. But I think, much like Indu just mentioned, I think advocacy can help to making sure that data is transparent. So because our continuum in New York works on a level where people with lived experience are in equal numbers with government reps and shelter providers, we have an equal say on processes happening within that continuum of care. And my interest in data, I started with the Data Management Committee early and understood the value of data. So data can be used in many different ways and manipulated, as Lydia mentioned earlier. But to get data and understand how services are being delivered or not being delivered is important. So collecting data in New York, we found very early on when this process started that a lot of money was going into what we call transitional housing. It doesn't necessarily lead to homeless people being permanently housed, but it showed us high rates of recidivism, people coming out of transitional housing, going back onto the streets, coming back into emergency shelter, transitional housing, back on the streets. So the data showed us that there were these high rates of recidivism. So how do we take that data and use it to better deliver services? Well, after conversations with our federal government, we said, we have to make a low priority of funding transitional housing. The goal is you're homeless because you don't have a home. So how do we permanently house people? And we need to push in the direction of creating more permanent housing. And that data was used in that aspect to help us change it. So our federal government made refunding transitional housing one of the lowest priorities in the federal government.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful insight, Rob. And again, I think in terms of transparency, it's often about the communication of it. I remember one time here in Chicago, I was doing a presentation about data and definitions to a room full of folks, many of whom had been homeless at one point. And I used Chicago's point-in-time count, which shows that we have about 5,000 people in Chicago who are living on the street or in the shelter on any given night. So that's our January 24th count every single year, where we scan the zones of the city and we count people who are sleeping on the streets or living in the emergency shelters. and the room of people said, no, that's definitely not right. I was homeless. That is a bizarrely low undercount. And they used another count that's commonly cited in Chicago of 80,000 people. And I put up IGH's framework, and I was very clear that this count of 5,000 people happened on one night through this visual survey count, and that the 80,000 count they were referencing used the definition of people who were doubled up, and that count used administrative data from Chicago public schools to kind of put together that number. And once I was able to clearly communicate what was being counted and how it was being counted, the tension in the room just disappeared. People understood that all the definitions were valid, the different counts were valid, but it was just different ways of getting to the same issue. And then I think out of that transparency came some points of advocacy. Do we need to advocate to the city government to expand the definition of homelessness to include that third category of people who are living doubled up, overcrowded with friends and family on kind of a temporary situation? So it was it started out very tense. I was answering some very pointed questions, but the communication kind of eased that. So Rob, you have something to say there?
Yeah, just quickly, Lydia, those types of challenges opens up space to really think through this issue and come up with bigger and better solutions, right? It doesn't always have to be a tense exchange and constant back and forth. Like, we're all working towards a common goal, right? And we understand that there are problems with the way certain data is collected, but it all has validity. So what is it we're trying to accomplish, and what are the paths to get there?
Exactly. So Indu, I'm sure you've been a part of some tense conversations around data there in Delhi. Do you see that tension mostly coming between civil society and governments, or is there even tension among the civil society groups that are working together?
I think it's actually more between the civil society and the government, because among the civil society, we have a good understanding and we join hands. Actually, the surveys that we did, it was with a group of civil society members, We didn't do it alone. We called a large number of organizations, and that's how we got volunteers. Like in Bengaluru, we had this, under the Vacant city, we had the survey done, last year. And in 2 nights, they counted 1,400 people in the zones where homeless people are concentrated. Similarly, in Bengaluru, we had done another survey way back in 2010. Okay, and here we actually, if you see, just in 2 nights, we counted, around 17,000 people who are homeless, 17,441 who are homeless, and the entire Karnataka government, in which Bangalore is a city, they said that there are only 5,000 homeless people in the entire state. One city had 17,000 and the entire state had 5,000. And as per them, Bangalore had only 2,000 people who are homeless. So by this kind of work that we have done, by every year and many times through different patches, like we have done similar surveys, Lydia, in many cities of India, whether it's Delhi, it's Mumbai, it's Pune, it's Kolkata, it's Hyderabad. Like, I showed you this, Pune is homeless. We've got a similar data where about 9,000 people are homeless. So we had the same methodology that from 7 evening till 12 o'clock, we do the interviews, and from midnight until early morning, we do the head count. And so many cities of India, we've done this, and we use the data to talk to the government. And we have used this data to also give it to the Supreme Court of India, So that helps us in building the public interest litigations as such in the country and supports our entire cause, We're not here, just for data. We are here for the cause. It's very important as such.
Yes. So some other interesting things I think that came out of those comments, Indu, you talked about both the interviews and the total count. And we do something similar here in Chicago where on that one night, if a person is awake and willing to engage and talk with the person who's out there counting, they'll ask them some demographic information to collect what is that person's gender, ethnicity, how long have they been homeless, how many times have they been homeless, do they have some mental health challenges or physical health challenges, and I see Rob nodding too. It looks like maybe there's a similar process there in New York.
Yeah, I think it filters down, and it's not always a street fight between civil society and government, right? I think there's a federal definition now of chronic homelessness that I think works. I'm in agreement with. Not everybody will agree, but it makes sense. One continuous year of being homeless or 4 instances of homelessness within 3 years. And it kind of makes sense. And I think from those types of conversations, you get this type of data that is very useful. Understanding the process that those persons went through to try to figure out how can we do better intake or better direct the people that are going through this life experience, right? To sort of put an end to it. So I think that, data again, while a lot of us, especially people with lived experience, are always leery with some good reasons of security issues, it's not always about following you and the security. It's about taking this data and changing the way we do advocacy or supporting the advocacy that's being done.
That's great. I often think of data in 2 levels. There's the high level count, which is important to knowing sort of trends over time. And that high level count is very important to advocacy with government for resources and for holding the government accountable for helping solve this problem. Then there's the second level of data, which is sort of that individual level data. So how many women are experiencing homelessness? How many families are experiencing homelessness? In the United States, people who have been part of our military are often very overrepresented in homelessness. So our veterans, how many of our veterans are homeless? Because once you have that next level of data, you can begin to develop more targeted solutions for those groups. A woman who is a single mother of a few children who's experiencing homelessness needs a different kind of service and a different set of services than, say, a single married or a single ex-military veteran who's returning home. So that, I think, is where the real power of the data comes in to make an impact on the people who are actually experiencing homelessness. So I don't think we can do one without the other. Both have their different purposes in the world. And we don't ever want to be collecting data just for data's sake. I think you can all tell I'm a huge nerd and I can talk for a really long time about data. But if it's not being put to use, it's pointless. We are in the business of ending homelessness, and data is a huge pillar of that work. So I'm going to ask both Indu and Rob, do you have an example of data being put to good use to have a positive impact on people who are experiencing homelessness?
In fact, Lydia, for us, since when we started the work, there weren't many studies on the homeless people. So one thing which we did was that we said we are going to document every bit of homelessness on the street. So we came out with a participatory reflection and action report. Okay. Mm-hmm. And here the homeless people have drawn the problems that they face, that there are rats in the shelters, there are all that, And this report we gave to the High Court of Delhi in a PIL we had, and due to which we got 2 shelters to run on a model basis. Okay. And similarly, in fact, there is this study that we had, which talked about understanding city makers. And here we did again a PRA, just a 4-page report, which showed that how the homeless women are being asked by Delhi police to supply young girls for sexual abuse. Can you believe it? And the High Court pulled up the commissioner of police, summoned him to the court and said, how dare you misbehave with the homeless people? So we don't require bulk information. We require targeted information, and even a 4-page report can fetch you a result which you have been working for years as such, But then you have to be thorough with the data, the research that you do. So there are different kinds of research, and we have used all kinds of research, surveys and PRAs and interviews, conversations, one-to-one, for that kind of work, So I think we have used the data in mitigating the problems that the homeless people face in the country as such. in Delhi as such. Yeah.
Thank you, Indu. Rob, do you have a specific example of?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I kind of laid out in the previous conversation, but I will go another angle with this. I think through that HMIS system and with the help of the federal government focusing on this in the prior administration, putting together called the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, there was a specific focus in 2010 to end homelessness in 10 years. Proved to be an overwhelming task, but then they narrowed that focus to veterans homelessness and really put time and energy into veterans homelessness and interviewing people on the streets, as you said, having conversations. It was somewhat absurd for people who served this country to be street homeless, and there wasn't a real focus on them. So that collecting that data allowed us to understand the degree of veterans homelessness and to really focus on it. And I'm proud to have been a part of that conversation to help many cities in the U.S. get it close to what we call functional zero, no homeless people being on the streets. And even here in New York, a rather large city, a city of 8.5 million people, we know who the 210 veterans are that aren't homeless at this time. And I'm able to give you that number because of the data. And then we work with the federal government in our advocacy roles to provide a means to get in housing with something, I don't want to get into the weeds, we call BASH vouchers, and able to distribute these vouchers to make sure that homeless veterans were getting into homes. And then sometimes they needed additional services. So we connected that with the Housing First policy. Let's get them housed, and then let's bring the services they need behind that. So I think there's a good example, and that civil society again, and different governmental administrations working together, because the voices of collecting that data came from representatives of people in advocacy who were on the streets, having conversations with veterans, building trust, and helping them to understand that there's a way out of this situation.
Great. So data, a powerful force for good. We should not sit in our offices or behind our computer screens looking at the data and thinking, oh, that's interesting. But we should always be looking at the data to improve our programs, our services, our advocacy, so that it's having a positive impact on people who are experiencing homelessness. I think the flip side of that is that sometimes data or data sharing can be used for questionable purposes. I remember one community in which we were working, the city government, the law enforcement arm of that city government really wanted access to that homeless data so that they could be kind of prosecuting people who were homeless for different crimes. And so we really had to put pause on that and say, help us understand.
Right. It can be detrimental. I mean, I've been involved in bringing the issue of criminalization to the homeless all the way to Geneva to end up getting a positive effect. And that was having that data to prove our point, but to bring the U.S. to Geneva and have other countries around the world question why this injustice exists and what are you going to do to correct it. So
that's right. So I think those of us who are the collectors and the holders of the data have a double-edged responsibility to make sure that it's used for positive and to put up a hedge of protection against those who would use that data for more stringent purposes. Indu, I see you nodding. Do you have something to share on that point?
Yeah. I think, we had made it very clear, Lydia, that any interviews we were doing with people, any information that we had, one was we would change the names or say the names are fictitious because we did not want any harm to come to them, because as such, the police and the administration is against the homeless people. And if they get to know that, oh, this person told about us this kind of a thing, so they'll further, victimize the person, and they're very vindictive as such. They can put you in jail, So we were very clear. So if suppose say ask you who said this, we said, listen, this is confidential. We will not share. They'll say you liable to action. I said, do whatever you want to do. We are not going to divulge you the information at all. So that data protection and that secrecy is very important for the homeless people, because we also need to give them dignity. They haven't got the dignity till date. And for us, if we divulge the details and all, it's going to hamper them because they actually have no support and we're making them more vulnerable by giving the information as such, So it's very important that the data is sacrosanct for us and we use it only to mitigate the problem, not to victimize the people who are homeless.
That's great, Indu. Thank you for those insights. And I think the privacy, the security, and the dignity of people who are experiencing homelessness needs to be played out in our collection and our use of the data. One thing that we constantly remind ourselves of at IGH, where we do have such a strong focus on the data, is that behind every single number is a human being with a human experience, a traumatic experience of being homeless, and of coming face to face with multiple forms of marginalization and oppression. And so just because we see those experiences reflected as numbers, we can never forget that behind those numbers is a human being. So Rob, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all. Oh, you're on mute, Rob. There you go.
I think it's valid. I do go a long way, but what I try to do is encourage folks that data can be used in a way to benefit, but it can also be used to a detriment. So one of the things we're good at doing here in New York, and it doesn't happen everywhere, but there's a collaborative effort of students who have mapping skills, who have good interviewing skills, policymakers, progressive lawyers that all work together, right, on a mission to make sure that the data that we collect is protected and protected within the bounds of the law, and making sure that nobody is penalized for talking or speaking up, right? And I like to use myself as a witness. I say, I have the lived experience, and I dare anybody to use it against me. And I understand I'm blessed to be able to be surrounded by this network of folks, but that's a shared network. That's not a network that Rob possesses. So I make it very clear, you have the same level of access to these folks as I do. I will give you anybody wants a name, contact, etc. And I think by the same token, there's a level of respect afforded by the data collectors and different levels of government that, you're not going to deal with one individual, you're going to deal with a force of individuals. So sit down, let's have a conversation, because this is going to be handled and done the right way. So that message, I think, resonates loud and clear in New York City.
That's great. Thank you, Rob. I'm going to ask my colleague Julia to join back in the conversation now. One of the things that IGH participates in is called the Inclusive Data Charter. Julia, could you share a little bit about that work and how it relates to the SDGs?
So IGH joined the Inclusive Data Charter this year, so we are excited to be a new champion. And the Inclusive Data Charter was developed by people at the Global Partnerships for Sustainable Data to ensure that SDGs, so Sustainable Development Goals, were collected, and they have disaggregations based on income, sex, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, and geographic location. So I think the importance of these disaggregations is to really make sure that you're supporting vulnerable and marginalized communities, and to make sure that when you're designing programs, you have data broken down by these areas, so you can really understand who you're working with and how to design programs that match these needs, and to really make sure that you're not, no program is one size fits all. And so to really understand, if you're working in a program and then there's more women, for example, in Bangalore, India, they found that they need to have women-only shelters because of security concerns of the women, and they don't have them currently. So doing like a survey of the whole city kind of spotlighted that issue. And so, the Inclusive Data Charter works with government statistical offices and nonprofits and organizations such as IGH to really improve the level of global disaggregated data, and to make more data, SDG data, and all data more inclusive, so that we can have better programs and more effective programs.
It's great. So, Julia, you're bringing up an important word there, inclusive data. So, the idea of inclusivity is really key to this idea of social cohesion. We talked a little bit earlier about the victimization of people who are experiencing homelessness and the stigma around homelessness across all sort of countries and contexts. So let's explore a little bit this idea of social inclusion and what it might mean to use data as a way to bring the issue of homelessness more to light. So I'm trying to sort of frame that into a question. I guess I'll just go to Indu and say, Indu, what does an inclusive society mean to you? What would your vision look like? I love the phrase that you use, city makers, because I think that is a word that is very inclusive. So if you could talk a little bit about that, how do we bring people who are homeless into the fabric and life of our communities?
Yes, I think in fact the word city makers is also the title of my fifth book, and I think the word came about after 10 years of work with the homeless people. We were not contented with this word called houseless. See, also like at times the words that we use are deficient of dignity. Houseless, what rubbish, houseless. These are people who are, in fact, they have got all the resources, but they're poor because of economic reasons. So when we use the word like city makers, it means that they have made the city with the sweat and labor, and they have every right to the city. And so in terms of inclusion also, we need to have terms which include the poor, and so it includes the poor men, the women, the disabled, the mentally, everybody. So until and unless, I think, like this was a term when even Robert Chambers, who does this PRA thing internationally, when he heard the term city makers, that's the term we all require. So a proper labeling is also equally important. So when you're talking about inclusion, I think, we need to include the homeless people, the city makers, into all our policies and programs and offer them a dignified existence. Offering them shelter with food, with rights is very important, Then having a proper housing continuum, which starts with shelters and ends with a proper housing. It doesn't remain with shelters, So inclusion is let everybody have a home. Shelters are a threshold, a beginning point. It is not the end for a person. Let us begin with shelters, but end with housing. So that's the real inclusion, A home-full society, not a homeless society, is what is inclusion.
Thank you, Indu. So some important points there is the language that we use is very critical in creating that inclusion, and that just because we're providing an emergency service does not mean that we've met that definition of inclusion. That true full participation means that you can have what I have, and that we work towards that level of equity. Rob, what does inclusiveness mean to you?
Well, as I'm listening to Indu's response, and I'm thinking geographically how we look at this stuff differently, right? And for me, my activism and advocacy came as a result of the narratives that were painted around homeless folks, right? You're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have an education. You're homeless because you have a chemical or an alcohol addiction. You're homeless because you have mental illness. And I'll just qualify that last one to say that's no reason why those folks shouldn't be served. They're part of society. So what is community is the bigger question that I ask. And I shedded those narratives. I refused to be painted with that broad brush. And that enraged me that people were being thought of in that context. But, the term houseless, and I've had debates here in the U.S. around this term houseless and homeless. Folks on the West Coast use the term all the time. I use homeless. But, Raquel Rolnick, the UN rapporteur from 2008 to 2014, said a home is more than a roof. It is a sense of community, and it is all these other things that come around it. So I think we have to really think in those terms, and language is important. I think the narratives that we paint around people, there are issues like poverty that all stand in the way of people achieving certain things or living this dignified life, right? And as somebody who's formerly homeless, I want to go on record as saying this. I'm not in favor of shelter because you have to be careful what you ask for. In New York, we're in favor of shelter, right? We spend $1.5 billion a year to house people in shelters, to house people in 550 shelters throughout a city. That's not getting people housed. That's not solving the problem. You're homeless because you don't have a home. So how do we move people to permanent housing is a bigger question. I think it's still a struggle, right? We have to think about it and we have to be careful with language because if you ask for shelter, we have proved in New York, we will build a shelter industrial complex. We can make it bigger than ever. And our current mayor is proposing building 90 more. That's not getting at the root cause of the problem. So, I just think that, society has to think a little bit different. And I think those of us who have the lived experience needs to be brought to the table to be a part of the conversation and a part of the solution. People who with the lived experience have the solutions to end that. And I think, and I'll just use one more piece on language. Leilani Farhar, who just left as rapporteur, created a report in 2018 listing informal settlements around the world. Mm-hmm. And that language would never be accepted in the US. But guess what? Those tent cities, those people living in tents on the streets of San Francisco are informal settlements. So yes, the US has informal settlements and we need to do something about it. Those are folks that are without a home and we need to figure out a solution.
That's right. I really could truly talk about this all day. It's such interesting things coming up in terms of the language that we use, how we are collecting and applying that data. Your point about the shelters, I think, Rob, is a really, really important one. It's, what you put resources into is what is going to grow. And I think it's really important to sort of use that data and understand how much crisis and temporary accommodation do we need. But then is one of our data points, how long are people experiencing homelessness? How long is it that they're remaining trapped, for lack of a better word, in this system? Because our ultimate goal and aim should be to move them on to their permanent home, such as
Lydia, if I could just follow up,
please.
That was the trigger for me into my activism. When I came out, people said to me, you were only in a shelter for 10 months? And I looked at people surprised and I said, that's 9 months too long. It should be an emergency situation. But I started hearing in New York City, I was there 5 years. I was there 7 years. Problem. All right. Problem number one, length of stay, huge, huge problem. And data reinforce that, right?
That's right. And, something, it's a bit jargony, but another thing that is often tracked is returns to homelessness. So once you have, been placed in your permanent accommodation, are you able to sustain that? Because again, I think there's a question about services. What kind of services do you need to remain stable in your home if you're dealing with something like, a mental health challenge? It's not enough just to have a home, but you may need to be wrapped with services and support in order to stay in that home. And I think that's where we've seen a failure of these systems by focusing on the wrong thing, that being shelter only or that being a roof only. The other point I wanted to come and sort of circle back on is this idea of community. And I think of homelessness a lot of times as the loss of community. Your community has failed you at so many levels to the point where you end up on the street. But I think the flip side of that is that everyone in community has a role to play in ending homelessness. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of multilateral partnerships and different stakeholders who need to be at the table. And I think what is often overlooked or used in a very tokenistic kind of way is this idea of bringing people of lived experience to the table. So Rob, I want to ask you first and foremost, what are some of the most effective ways that you have seen, the most respectful ways that you have seen of bringing people with that experience of homelessness to the table?
So two ways, and I'll talk from different directions. One is our continuum and restructuring our continuum of care in New York to have equal voices be a part of our steering committee, to have voting representation on that $120 million. We know in the US, power is access to resources and money, right? So if decision makers have equal say on how $120 million are being distributed, everything looks different. But for me personally, there was a time when my voice was rising with respect to homelessness in New York City. And I was invited to a meeting that was held by then Mayor Bloomberg. And there were about 20 to 25 different representatives of New York City government at different levels at the table. And I was the only person who represented homeless people at the table. And before the meeting started, I asked the mayor, I said, Mayor Bloomberg, did you ever sleep on a piece of cardboard? And he looked at me and said, excuse me? I said, did you ever sleep on a piece of cardboard? And he says, no, I don't think I have. And then I said, then how is it that there are 25 people around this table, probably like you, who have never slept on a piece of cardboard, making decisions about people who have? The meeting abruptly ended. It was reconvened about 3 months later, and there was equal representation at the table from that point on. And New York City started to engage people with lived experience at a different level, bringing them into the conversations, whether it be McKinney-Vento funding or other sources of money coming into New York City to support homeless and homeless services. So I think the activism part and the advocacy part and making your voice heard, right? Sometimes you might be lifted up as an individual with experience and knowledge, but you have to open that door, use your leverage to open that door to bring other folks into the space and have the conversations.
That's a really good story, Rob. And I can only imagine it takes courage to speak truth to power. And you took that opportunity and had a great result. And I think, we need to see the participation of people who have lived expertise as full and equal partners, and have those tables reflect that this is not just a box to check, but that this is a partnership. Indu, in what way do you bring city makers into the decision-making process there in India?
Yeah, in fact, Lydia, right from, I would say, initial months of our work in 2000, we were very clear that this work would be led by the homeless people. And so even for the survey that we did, we had many homeless join us for the survey and say that we'll do these points, So they became part of the survey. When we had expansion of a team, many of the homeless were part of a team. Okay, so the lived experience was what was guiding our work. We had one homeless person right from the first day of our work in 2000, So, and that actually enhanced the capacities of work. And so we had a rule that for any official meeting that we go, we will have to have homeless people, the city makers, with us. So men and women and children would join us in the meetings. So whether it was protest actions, whether it was meeting with the officials, our people would go there, and then we would be there telling them, listen, please speak up. And you know what? They have brought in those nuances. And that's the reason why I think we had many of the changes coming in the government policies. In fact, we took the city makers to the courts also. They were there in front of judges. And when the judges would see them, they say, hey, listen, what are you doing for the homeless people? And so in a way, for us, it was very important. It was not just tokenistic. I think for everything that we did, like today, many homeless shelters are being run by the homeless themselves. Many of the homeless are themselves shelter caretakers. Many of the homeless women have gone through a program and they're taking care of other homeless women. So I think it's very important to bring them. And then many of the chemically dependent people have undergone the proper rehabilitation. And today, they are the ones who are leading the program for chemical dependence, to do with chemical dependence. I think it's very important. Like I think in the US, the phrase is nothing on us without us, right? So this is something which we have been following from way back, nothing of the city makers without the city makers, So I think that works.
That's wonderful, Indu. I think I really appreciate your mention of bringing the children as well. I think that's another point of inclusivity, that we bring young people and children into these conversations. We often overlook their insights and their experience of this as well. So another important point of inclusivity, and also, love you bringing the folks right to the decision makers, right to the people in power, to sort of say, we will not let you look away from our humanity and from our experience, because you have the power to make the change here. And that wonderful phrase that we all are familiar with comes out of the disability movement, actually, in the United States in the 70s, nothing about us without us. And I think that that's something that we all take to heart. So we have 15 minutes remaining, and we have some questions coming in through the chat. Tanya asks, I noticed the point mentioning women and children escaping abuse and staying in shelters because of that abuse. I understand that this forms a category on its own, but women could also experience other kinds of homelessness listed in all parts of the framework. So does that mean that some of them overlap, and the distinction may not be as clear in some cases? So thinking back to our framework, yes, absolutely. Women and men and people of all types of gender identities can be experiencing those forms. We do think it important to call out that particular driver of homelessness, domestic abuse for women. Indu, I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to that issue of domestic abuse and violence, and how that particularly impacts women.
Yeah, Lydia, in fact, we haven't come across many women, and we have got them in the shelters now, when earlier we had no shelters for homeless women at all in Delhi. We know that most of the women who are homeless, they are because the families are disturbed. They are there because of domestic violence as such. The spouses, they are there because of spousal violence. The man gets drunk and beats them. The problem, very peculiar with the women, homeless women, is that actually, Lydia, in India, a homeless man can go back to his family, but a homeless woman, once she's homeless for life. She loses the family, she loses everything, she can never go back. So that's very important. And many women have actually been cases, they have been domestic violence survivors, plus sexual abuse survivors and all those things, So it's a big problem as such. It's not a small problem for homeless women,
Yes, so women needing some special protections because of the additional oppression and marginalization that women face. And there also is some particular data security issues. I know that at least in the United States, the sort of domestic violence sector is very, very hesitant to share that data with the homelessness sector because of the importance of privacy and protection for women who are maybe fleeing an abuser, and how easy it is in this sort of technological age to find someone who is trying to flee from you. And so we have had to get creative on the homeless and housing side as to how do we best work with the domestic violence sector to make sure that women who are escaping abuse can access these channels for housing, but in a way that does not compromise their security. Thank you, Indu. Okay, another question from Sho, who's been a friend of IGH for a long time. What if some countries do not or prefer not to use the term homeless to count it in their countries? Rob, do you have an insight on that from some of your international work?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, in Europe, the term sleeping rough is a popular term. So for me, somebody who works with these populations around the world, I've had to learn different languages with respect to how homelessness is talked about, right? So there are a lot of different ways to talk about it, but I've been, and I work a lot with universities, so we've been able to work in a way where we can rephrase language. I don't speak many different languages, although I've been to many countries. I'm monolingual, right? You would think that I would know Portuguese. I've been to Brazil 8 times, but I think we find ways to understand that the issue is the same issue. right? And how we talk about it, we have to find some type of common language, and it seems to work out, right? The term, I'll go back to sleeping rough, which was, a shock to me. Early on in my advocacy, I went to Hungary, and I kept hearing that term, and I kept saying homeless, and people would look at me, and well, the shelter's a home. And I'm like, no, that's not a home, right? And then there are certain obstacles to prevent you from getting into shelter, right? When communism fell in Eastern Europe, it was housing was tied to work. So all of a sudden, communism falls. There's no work. People start sleeping rough. And because you don't have a permanent address, you can't get work. So it's a complicated issue where we had to find common ground and common language to work through. But I think there are methodologies in place now where we do that. And I think common language has been developed through the UN, but also through other grassroots movements like the Global Platform on the Right to the City, which talks a lot about this and has been challenging some of those sustainable development goals that you talk about because the language is weak, right? And saying we need common language that we can all work with.
That's great, Rob. Thank you. So the discovery process to uncover what different countries mean through just various terminology around homelessness. Again, I think it's never up to IGH to say what is or isn't homelessness. We work in deep partnership with communities to sort of uncover that and to support them in that journey to end whatever form of homelessness their citizens, their neighbors are experiencing, whether that is termed homelessness or not. Okay, we have at least one more question here. So Jennifer asks, I lived in Philly, DC, and New York City. Have we ever considered replacing abandoned buildings with more wraparound independent living services and housing for those who are homeless versus letting buildings sit unused in the community? And is that something that could be considered globally? So Rob, I'm going to pitch this one to you, knowing your activism on sort of land rights and
Right.
usage.
So Michelle, I believe the person's name was?
Jennifer.
I'm sorry, Jennifer. My introduction into community organizing was through a group called Picture the Homeless in New York. And that is probably the door that I walked in through, as they were doing an abandoned building count to send a message to New York City that you're spending all this money to put people in shelters when you have all of this vacant property. So there are 2 reports produced by the organization Picture the Homeless that you can find where they did vacant building counts. One was in 2006 and the second one was in 2011. And the challenge was to the city to take this vacant space and create permanent housing for people in a city where housing has gotten out of hand. So it's been the big battle cry of a lot of people here in New York. It is spreading to places like Philly. I work with groups like One Philly and some others. And, I work with the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty in DC, where they're pushing that voice out nationally. But we have forced New York City into something called the vacant census count. New York City came back to us and said, there are not that many vacant spaces, but homeless people counted them. Just like the Hindus group did in India, we counted the vacant spaces, put it in a report and said, here they are. Like, what are you going to do with them? You have right now 35,000 people in shelters. There's enough vacant space to house all those people permanently. So it really argued for different thinking and different methodologies and a reinvestment in community, right? So stop taking the funds and creating shelters, these places to hide homelessness, as I like to refer to it. Shelters are a place to hide the homeless, to remove the visibility of homeless, and solve the problem by creating space to create permanent housing for people. So it's a big battle cry here in New York, and it still continues. We forced that city into a vacant building count. Now we have to force them into doing something with that count that they do every year to make it a reality to create permanent homes for people.
And I think this also speaks to the commoditization and the financialization of buildings and land, right? Like, I know in Chicago, we have a legal requirement on the books that any new development contain a certain percentage of affordable housing in which a person in that unit wouldn't pay any more than 30% of their income. And that can be sort of government subsidies, et cetera. But there's a loophole in which developers can pay a certain amount of money to get out of that requirement. And guess what? The majority of them tend to pay that fee, get out of that requirement, because they know if they rent that luxury apartment, they will more than make up the money of that fee over time. So, okay, this 90 minutes has flown by. We have just 5 minutes left. So I'm going to come around to each of you to say, what is one if the audience listening today takes away one thing from this discussion around data and social inclusion for people who are homeless, what do you want them to take away? Indu, I'll come to you first.
I think my one takeaway would be that, I think let us all sincerely join the efforts in counting the homeless people, the city makers, and finding a way out by including them in finding the way out. And we need the entire society perspective, the whole society perspective to deal with homelessness. It cannot be one stakeholder. I think it has to be all of us together handling this issue. Only then we can end homelessness,
Thank you, Indu. Rob, I'll come to you next.
So I certainly agree with Indu. This is a societal problem that can only be fixed by society. But I want to touch on something you just mentioned at the end there. We think of financial way of solving all of our problems. The market is not going to solve homelessness, right? So we have to get out of that mindset, right? The financialization of housing, and in New York, and I'll just say this so you guys get a better understanding of the air rights in Manhattan, because that's why they build multi-story buildings, because the air is for sale. We have to get out of that mindset, and we need to find a way in the wealthiest country to be able to house people. But, as the U.S. goes, so goes the rest of the world. So if they look up to us as the model, then we need to be the country that sets the model to say that we can go after this problem and end it. We have the knowledge, we have the will, or we need to have the will. Let me rephrase that. We need to have the will to do it. I think we can, but again, I'll follow up into it. It's not going to be one non-governmental organization, one advocacy group. It needs to be the collective of society that goes after this problem and works together to end it. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, Julia, I'll come to you. What's your takeaway for today's audience?
So I think my call would be that there's an urgent need now more than ever to end homelessness, especially during COVID-19, to protect and house people experiencing homelessness. And that underscores the importance of having accurate, reliable, transparent, and importantly, inclusive data with a definition and methodology that fits context. And as Indu said, needs to be collaborative and done with the participation of people of lived experience, so that it can be used to end homelessness in communities and countries throughout the world.
Great, thank you. So I think if I had to summarize all those wonderful calls to action with one sort of key takeaway, is that we all have a role in bringing an end to this problem that exists in every single corner of the world, no matter what it is called. And so we really welcome your participation at IGH. Please find us online at ighomelessness.org and on all of the various social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. And then also you can participate in that online conversation through the C20. I think there are still some wonderful panels and conversations happening today. So please, participate in other C20 events and do what you can, through these different events and the C20 Summit and the C20 working groups to continue to bring this issue of homelessness to the conversation, to the forefront, on up all the way through the G20. As the G20 goes, so goes the world. And so, this making the invisible visible to the power holders in the G20 is something that we all can do together. There is also a United Nations Working Group to End Homelessness. IGH is a partner of that, along with, I think, 30 other different organizations around the world who care about this issue. So certainly they have a website as well that you can look up. Rob, do you have any organizations that you'd like to share with the audience today where they could get involved?
I certainly would say former UN Rapporteur Leilani Farha has brought up a lot of the issues that we brought up today, particularly the financialization issue. It was a huge part of her mandate. She is launching a website today. It's called Make the Shift. If you go out to Make the Shift, she has a very impassioned 2-minute speech out there. I promoted it this morning. She is somebody that I work closely with. She also has a film that's going around called Push, which documents the stories of people around the world who are experiencing homelessness and what could be done. And then the organization that I'm speaking to you from now is called Partners for Dignity and Rights. And it's where I got my foundation and working in UN mechanisms along with the US Human Rights Network. Those are folks who came to me as a homeless person and a homeless activist and said, here are some tools you could use. We're willing to support you. So I think all of those organizations are a part of this effort and, a part of that collaboration that I mentioned when I gave my, final words. So thank you for this opportunity. And I certainly would say I learned a lot about Institute for Global Homelessness, and we will be forever joined at the hip from this point henceforth. And I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this dialogue.
Thank you, Rob. Indu, are there any organizations in India or elsewhere that you'd like to point out to the audience today?
Yeah, in fact, I want to point out we got a very good support from the former UN Special Rapporteur on Undergraduate Housing, Dr. Milun Kothari. He was a UN Special Rapporteur from 2001 to 2008, and he supported our work in India in a big way. So he belongs to this Habitat International Coalition, HIC. And I would say that's one group that one needs to also align with. And that's been a big support to the work that we've been doing in India and other parts of the country and the world. So that's what I would say.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Rob, Indu, and Julia for being part of this conversation. Thank you again to the C20 for hosting us, and thanks to the audience for joining today. And we will watch for your involvement through IGH and through these other wonderful organizations, because together we will build a movement that cannot be stopped, and we will bring an end to global homelessness. So thank you all. Bye-bye.